"Uncle, could you be my dad for a day?" The little black girl whispered the words, her voice barely louder than her breath. Daniel Whitmore froze. He had been sitting on the bench outside the pediatric wing, one ankle crossed over the other, hands folded loosely as he waited for his assistant to return with paperwork. He was used to waiting in private terminals, in quiet offices, in places where time bent around his schedule. This was supposed to be another one of those moments. It wasn't. He turned slowly toward the sound, half expecting to see a nurse or an anxious parent. Instead, he found a child standing no more than 3 feet away from him. She was trembling, not dramatically. Not enough for anyone rushing past to notice, but in the small, contained way children tremble when they are forcing themselves to be brave. Her knees were slightly bent, as if she might bolt or collapse at any second. One hand clutched the edge of her faded jacket, the other twisted nervously in front of her chest. Daniel's breath caught. For a second, his mind refused to catch up with what his ears had just heard. "Did you say something?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. The girl swallowed hard. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again, clearly rehearsing courage she was about to spend all at once. "I asked if you could be my dad," she said, then hurried to add, "just for one day." Daniel stared at her. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking. He had stood in front of rooms full of politicians and donors, choosing words like weapons. But now, faced with a 6-year-old girl who looked like she might disappear if he said the wrong thing, he had nothing. His mouth opened. No sound came out. The girl glanced over her shoulder, toward a hospital room farther down the hall. The door was half closed. From where Daniel sat, he could see the pale edge of a hospital bed, the stillness of someone lying inside. She looked back at him quickly, as if afraid he might vanish. "My name is Annie," she said. "I'm 6. Daniel nodded once, too stiffly. "Daniel," he replied automatically. Then, realizing how absurd that sounded, he added, Why are you asking me that, Annie?" Her fingers tightened. "Because you look like a dad," she said simply. The answer hit him harder than any explanation could have. Before he could respond, she rushed on, the words tumbling out unevenly. "I didn't mean it like you have to really be one. I know you don't know me. I just—" Her voice wavered, and she paused to take a breath. "My mom is really sick, and they're sending her home." Daniel felt his posture change, his body leaning forward without his permission. "They said there's nothing else they can do," Annie continued. "She sleeps a lot now, and when she wakes up, she smiles at me like she's trying not to scare me." She blinked hard but didn't cry. "I want to take a picture," she said. "A family picture." Daniel felt a tightening in his chest. "A picture?" he repeated. She nodded. "Just one. With my mom. And a dad. So she can see it. So she knows I wasn't alone. 2. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next. 1. The hallway noise faded around them. The rolling carts, the distant intercom announcements, the footsteps of strangers moving past lives that were not theirs, it all blurred. Daniel looked at Annie again. Really looked. At the dark circles beneath her eyes. At the way her shoulders stayed tense, even while standing still. At how she was asking for something enormous with the careful politeness of a child who had learned not to demand. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Annie hesitated, then lifted her chin a little, as if the answer embarrassed her. "Because you're here," she said, "and because you don't look mad, and because you look like you wouldn't laugh." "Where?" Something inside Daniel cracked. He thought of his own childhood, a memory he usually kept sealed away, standing in school hallways during Father's Day activities, watching other kids hand over drawings and cards while he pretended to tie his shoe, hearing teachers stumble over questions they shouldn't have asked. He remembered wishing fiercely, foolishly, that for just one day, someone would stand beside him so he didn't look different. He exhaled slowly. "Annie," he said, choosing each word with care, "being a dad it's not just standing in a picture. I know. she said quickly. I know it's more than that. I don't need more. I just need today. Her voice dropped to a whisper again. Please. Daniel looked down at his hands. They were steady. That surprised him. If I do this, he said, it wouldn't be pretending to make fun of you. Or your mom. She shook her head so hard her braids bounced. No, I'd never do that. I promise. Except. Another pause. What would I have to do? He asked. Her eyes widened, hope flickering there before she tried to hide it. Just stand with us. Maybe hold my hand. And smile. Like we're a family. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He knew this was dangerous. Not legally. Emotionally. He knew how children attached. He knew how fragile moments like this could become if they were treated carelessly. But he also knew what it felt like to grow up without a single photograph that proved you belonged somewhere. He stood. The movement made Annie stiffen, and immediately he softened his posture, crouching down so they were level. For one day, he said quietly. And one picture. Annie stared at him, her face blank with shock. Really? She asked. Yes, he replied, surprising himself with how certain his voice sounded. I can do that. Her breath left her in a rush. She nodded, then nodded again, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck with sudden, fierce trust. Daniel remained still for half a second, then carefully placed a hand on her back. She was warm, solid, real. Thank you, she whispered. My mom is going to be so happy. Daniel swallowed, as Annie took his hand and began leading him down the hallway toward the room with the half-closed door. A single, unshakable thought settled in his mind. This was supposed to be one day, but nothing about the way his chest felt suggested it would end that simply. Daniel walked beside Annie down the hallway. His steps measured to match her short stride. Her hand was small in his, warm and slightly damp, gripping him with a certainty that unsettled him more than he expected. She didn't look back to check if he was still there. She assumed he was. That assumption landed heavily on his shoulders. Room 312 came into view. The door was half open, the light inside dimmer than the hallway, as if the room itself were trying to be gentle. Annie slowed, her grip tightening. My mom's name is Renee, she said softly, suddenly serious again. She gets tired fast, and she worries a lot. So, don't tell her anything scary. Daniel nodded. I won't. She studied his face for a second, as if deciding whether she trusted that promise. Then she pushed the door open the rest of the way. Renee lay propped up against thin pillows, her frame swallowed by the bed. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound, instinctively searching for Annie. When she saw her daughter, a faint smile appeared, fragile but real. There you are, Renee said. I was wondering where you went. I was right outside, Annie replied quickly. Then she hesitated, glanced at Daniel, and took a breath. Mom, I want you to meet someone. Renee's gaze shifted past Annie, landing on Daniel. Confusion crossed her face first, then caution. Daniel straightened instinctively, acutely aware of how out of place he must look in this small, worn room. He had stood in hospitals before, but never like this, never as a guest in someone else's life. Hello, he said gently. I'm Daniel. Renee studied him, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. I'm Renee, she said. Can I help you? Annie stepped closer to the bed, placing her small hand over her mother's. Mom, she said carefully, this is my dad. For today. The room went very still. Daniel felt the weight of that sentence pressed down on him, heavy and irreversible. Renee's eyes widened slightly. She looked at Annie, then back at Daniel, then at Annie again. 1,000 questions flickered across her face, followed quickly by something else, fear. Annie, she said quietly. What are you talking about, baby? Annie's voice shook, but she didn't back down. I just wanted a picture, she said. A family picture, so you could see it. Just one. Renee's gaze returned to Daniel, sharper now, defensive. I don't know what my daughter told you, she said, her voice tight. But we don't need charity. And we don't. This was her idea, Daniel interrupted gently. Not mine. That stopped her. He took a small step forward, keeping his hands visible, his posture open. She asked me if I could help her. For today. That's all. Renee closed her eyes for a moment, exhaustion washing over her features. When she opened them again, there was shame there, raw and painful. I'm sorry, she said. She shouldn't have asked you that. Annie, come here. Annie shook her head fiercely. No, please don't be mad. I'm not mad, Renee said, reaching weakly for her. I just don't want you thinking you need to. Daniel spoke before she could finish. She doesn't think that, he said quietly. She thinks you deserve something good. Renee looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether this man was dangerous or simply unexpected. What exactly are you offering? She asked. Daniel swallowed. Nothing permanent. Nothing that would confuse her more than this already is. Just a moment. A picture. Something she can hold on to. Renee's eyes filled despite her effort to stop them. She turned her face away slightly, embarrassed by the tears slipping free. She's been so brave, Renee whispered. Braver than she should have to be. Annie climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, curling against her mother's side. I just want you to be happy, she murmured. Renee pressed her forehead against Annie's hair, her shoulders trembling. When she looked back at Daniel, her expression had changed. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by something heavier. If this hurts her, she said, I won't forgive myself. Daniel nodded once. I understand. There was a pause. Then Renee let out a long, tired breath. Okay, she said quietly. One picture. It fine. Annie's face lit up, pure relief breaking through her careful composure. She turned to Daniel, eyes shining. Really? Yes, Renee said. Really? Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Something he hadn't realized was clenched. They didn't rush. A nurse was asked politely for help. A phone was produced, old and scuffed but functional. Renee was helped into a more upright position. Pillows adjusted until she was comfortable. Daniel stood awkwardly at first, unsure where to place himself. Annie solved that problem by grabbing his hand and tugging him closer until he stood beside the bed, her small body pressed against his leg. Put your arm here, she instructed, guiding his hand around her shoulders with authority. He obeyed. Renee watched them, her lips trembling as she smiled. You look like you've done this before, she teased weakly. Daniel shook his head. I haven't. The nurse lifted the phone. Ready? Annie beamed. Wait, she said, suddenly serious. She reached for Daniel's other hand and placed it gently over her mother's. Like this. Daniel felt Renee's thin fingers beneath his palm. He held them carefully, afraid of breaking something precious. The camera clicked. Once, twice, and just like that, it was done. Annie let out a breath she'd been holding for days, maybe longer. She looked at the screen, then up at Daniel, her smile wide and unguarded. We look like a real family, she said. Daniel didn't trust himself to answer. Later, when the nurse left and the room grew quiet again, Renee looked at Daniel with gratitude and sadness tangled together. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to do this. Daniel nodded. I know. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned toward the door, instinctively preparing to step back into his own life. Annie noticed immediately. You're not leaving yet, she said, panic creeping into her voice. Daniel paused. He looked at her. At Renee. At the small, dim room that now felt heavier than any boardroom he'd ever entered. I'm right outside, he said gently. I'll stay. Annie relaxed, nodding. Okay. As Daniel stepped back into the hallway and sat down on the bench again, he stared at his hands. They were steady, but something inside him had shifted, and he knew without fully understanding how that the man who had walked into the hospital that morning was already gone. Daniel remained on the bench outside room 312 long after the door closed behind him. The hallway felt different now, quieter, not because the sounds had stopped the distant hum of machines, the murmur of voices, the soft squeak of rubber soles against polished floors were all still there, but because he was listening differently. He wasn't waiting for paperwork anymore. He wasn't counting minutes until his phone buzzed. He was listening for a child's voice. Inside the room, Annie laughed softly at something her mother said. It was a small sound, weak, but unmistakably alive. Daniel found himself leaning slightly toward the door, as if proximity alone could make him part of it. He checked his watch out of habit. Then he frowned and slipped it off his wrist, sliding it into his coat pocket. Time suddenly felt irrelevant, even rude. A nurse approached, holding a clipboard. She glanced at Daniel, then at the door. "Family?" she asked gently. The word caught him off guard. "Yes," he said, before thinking. The nurse nodded, offering a small, understanding smile. "We'll need to go over discharge instructions soon," she said. "She'll need someone with her tonight." Daniel's first instinct was to say, "I'm not," but the nurse was already moving on, calling another name down the hall. "Someone with her tonight," the phrase echoed. He stood and walked to the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the gray afternoon. The city stretched below, indifferent and busy. Somewhere out there, his driver was probably waiting, checking his phone, wondering why a simple hospital visit was taking so long. Daniel didn't reach for his own phone. Instead, his mind drifted backward, to a different hallway in a different building decades ago. A public school. Fluorescent lights. Lockers dented and loud. He remembered sitting alone during a Father's Day assembly, pretending to tie his shoe while teachers avoided his eyes. He remembered the sharp embarrassment of explaining, year after year, that no one was coming. He had survived that emptiness. Thrived, even. Built a life so full of achievement that there was no room left to notice what was missing. Until now, the door to room 312 opened quietly. Annie stepped out, closing it carefully behind her. "You said you'd stay," she said, her voice steady but questioning. Daniel turned immediately. "I'm still here." She studied his face, searching for something invisible. Satisfied, she nodded. "My mom's asleep," Annie said. The nurse gave her medicine. She said it might make her dizzy. Daniel crouched slightly to meet her eye level. "How are you doing?" Annie shrugged. "Okay." It was the same word she'd used earlier, the kind kids used when they didn't have better ones. She hesitated, then held up the phone. The cracked screen displayed the photo they had just taken. The three of them together. Annie in the middle, beaming. Renee pale but smiling. Eyes full. Daniel standing beside them, expression softer than he remembered having in years. "I'm going to remember this forever," Annie said quietly. Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. "So am I." She tilted her head. "Have you ever had a family picture?" He shook his head. "Not like that." "Where?" She seemed to consider this. "Then this can be yours too." The simplicity of the statement stunned him. Annie slipped her hand into his again, as naturally as if she'd been doing it for years, and led him back into the room. Renee stirred slightly as they entered, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Daniel, she smiled faintly. "You're still here," she said. "Yes," he replied, "if that's okay." Renee looked at Annie, then back at him. "It's more than okay," she said softly. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken things. "I don't know how long I'll be," Renee said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. They didn't say it out loud, but I know. Daniel nodded. He respected the truth too much to argue with it. "I worry about her," Renee continued, her hand tightening weakly around Annie's fingers. "She's strong, but she shouldn't have to be." Annie leaned against the bed. "I'll be fine, Mom." Renee smiled, but her eyes were wet. "I know you will," she said. Then she looked at Daniel again. "She's never asked for much. This mattered." "It mattered to me too," Daniel said honestly. Renee studied him, seeing something she hadn't before. "Why?" she asked. "You don't owe us anything." Daniel took a breath. For once, he didn't hide behind a careful answer. "Because I was her once," he said quietly, and no one stayed. The truth settled into the room like a fragile object no one wanted to drop. Renee closed her eyes, nodding slowly. "Then I'm glad she found you." Annie squeezed Daniel's hand. "Me too." The afternoon faded into evening. Nurses came and went. Instructions were explained gently. Bags were packed with the few belongings Renee had brought. Daniel listened. He asked questions. He took notes. No one questioned his presence. When it was time to leave, Renee was helped into a wheelchair. Annie clung to her side, careful and attentive. Outside, the air was cool and sharp. Daniel removed his coat without thinking and draped it over Annie's shoulders. "You'll get cold," she protested weakly. "So will you," he replied. She accepted it, pulling it tight around herself. As they waited for transport, Annie looked up at him. "Are you still my dad tomorrow?" The question was casual, almost careless. But Daniel heard the fear underneath. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at Renee, at Annie, at the picture burned into his mind. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like yet," he said slowly. "But I'm not going anywhere tonight." Annie nodded, accepting that answer for now. And Daniel realized, with a clarity that frightened him, that this had already gone far beyond a picture. The drive from the hospital was quiet. Daniel sat in the back seat beside Annie, while Renee rested in the front passenger seat, reclined slightly, her eyes closed. The driver glanced at Daniel in the rearview mirror once, clearly surprised to see a child there, then wisely said nothing. Annie leaned against Daniel's arm, her head barely reaching his shoulder. She smelled faintly of hospital soap and something sweeter underneath, like the strawberry shampoo children used. Daniel kept his arm still, afraid that if he moved, she might pull away. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, their glow sliding across the windows and disappearing again. Annie traced patterns on the fogged glass with her finger, then stopped. "Do you live in a big house?" she asked suddenly. Daniel blinked. "Yes," he said. "I suppose I do. Like the ones with stairs inside." "Yes. And a kitchen island?" she pressed. He smiled faintly. "Yes. One of those too." Annie nodded, satisfied, as if checking off items on an invisible list. "We don't have stairs," she said. "Just one hallway." "But that's okay." Daniel glanced at her. "Is it?" She shrugged. "It's home." The word settled between them. They arrived at the apartment building just as the sky began to darken. It was an old brick structure, its paint chipped, the entryway dimly lit. Daniel stepped out first, instinctively offering a hand to Renee as the driver helped her into a wheelchair. "I can walk a little," Renee protested weakly. Daniel shook his head gently. "You don't have to." Annie followed closely as they entered the building, the smell of old carpet and cooking oil filling the narrow hallway. The elevator was broken, so they moved slowly up one flight of stairs. Daniel carried the small overnight bag without comment. Inside the apartment, the space was cramped but clean. A small couch, a narrow kitchen, toys neatly stacked in one corner, family drawings taped to the wall, mostly stick figures, always two of them, never three. Annie noticed Daniel looking. "I didn't know how to draw dads," she said matter-of-factly. Daniel swallowed. "You did fine." Renee was helped onto the couch, her movements slow and careful. She watched Daniel take in the space, waiting for judgment that never came. "I know it's not much," she said quietly. "It's enough," he replied. That seemed to surprise her. Daniel made tea without asking, moving through the small kitchen with a cautious respect, as if entering someone else's life required permission. Annie sat at the table, swinging her legs, watching him intently. "You make tea like my mom," she observed. He paused. "Is that good?" She smiled. "Yeah." Later, as Renee rested, Annie disappeared into her room and returned holding a worn photo album. She climbed onto the couch beside Daniel and opened it carefully. "These are me," she said, pointing to baby pictures. "And this is my mom when she was younger. She used to laugh more." Daniel studied the photos, each one a small window into a life he hadn't known existed that morning. "You don't have to look at all of them," Annie said. "I want to," he replied. She leaned against him again, heavier this time, her eyelids drooping. The day had caught up with her. "Dad?" she murmured, half asleep. The word landed softly but firmly. "Yes?" he answered, before he could stop himself. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Yes," he said again. This time, there was no hesitation. He carried her gently to her bed, tucking the thin blanket around her small body. She clutched his sleeve as he tried to stand. "You promised," she said sleepily. "I know." He sat on the edge of the bed, awkward and unsure, until her breathing evened out. Only then did he stand. In the living room, Renee watched him with tired eyes. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You've done more than enough." Daniel shook his head. "I want to." She studied him for a long moment. "She's already attached." "I know," he said. "And that doesn't scare you?" "Yes," he admitted. "It does." Renee nodded slowly. "Then you understand how much this matters." They sat in silence for a while. "She won't say it," Renee said finally. "But she's afraid. Of being alone." Daniel thought of the empty rooms in his own house. "So am I." It sighed. Renee smiled faintly. "Then maybe this isn't an accident." That night, Daniel lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing from the bedroom down the hall. He had spent years believing he was immune to this kind of vulnerability. He was wrong, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like a weakness. Morning came quietly. Daniel woke before the sun, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar ceiling above him. The couch creaked softly when he shifted, the thin blanket half on, half off. For a split second, his instinct was to reach for his phone, to check messages, schedules, obligations. He didn't. Instead, he listened. The apartment was still. Too still. Then, from down the narrow hallway, he heard the faint sound of a child coughing, followed by the creak of a bed. He sat up immediately. Annie stood in the doorway, rubbing one eye with the sleeve of Daniel's coat, which hung off her small shoulders like armor. "Dad?" she whispered, unsure. "I'm here," he said at once, his voice rough with sleep. Her shoulders dropped in relief. She padded toward him, stopping just short. "Mom's awake." Daniel was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Renee was sitting up when they entered the bedroom, her face drawn but alert. She looked smaller than she had the night before, as if the night had taken something from her. When she saw Daniel, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by gratitude. "You didn't leave," she said. "No," Daniel replied. "I said I wouldn't." She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "I don't feel so good today," Renee admitted quietly. "My chest feels tight." Daniel stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "Do you want me to call the hospital?" Renee hesitated. She looked at Annie, then back at Daniel. "They told me what they'd do," she said. "More waiting, more tests. I don't think that's what I want today." Daniel understood. He didn't argue. "I'll stay," he said instead. Annie climbed onto the bed beside her mother, curling carefully at her side. Daniel pulled a chair close and sat, placing a glass of water within Renee's reach. For a while, they just existed together in the small room. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating dust in the air. Outside, a car door slammed. Somewhere, a neighbor's radio played softly. Normal life went on. "Annie," Renee said after a while, her voice gentle but firm. "Can you bring me the picture?" Annie's face lit up. She jumped down from the bed and ran to the kitchen table, returning with the phone clutched carefully in both hands. She held it up so her mother could see. Renee stared at the photo for a long time. Tears slid down her temples into her hair. "She looks so happy," Renee whispered. Annie nodded proudly. "I was." Renee shifted her gaze to Daniel. "You gave her something I couldn't," she said. "And I hate that I needed help." "You didn't fail her," Daniel said quietly. "You protected her. That counts." Renee studied him, then smiled weakly. "You sound like someone who's thought about that a lot." Daniel didn't answer. The morning passed slowly. Renee dozed in and out of sleep. Annie colored quietly at the table, humming to herself. Daniel made toast, cut into triangles the way Annie liked, and soup that warmed the apartment with its simple smell. At one point, Annie looked up from her crayons. "Do dads always stay?" she asked, not looking at him. Daniel felt the question lodge deep in his chest. "Good ones try," he said carefully. She considered this. "Will you try?" "Yes," he said. That answer felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed. By early afternoon, Renee's breathing had grown more labored. She waved Daniel closer. "There's something I need to say," she murmured. Daniel leaned in. "She trusts you," Renee said. "More than she's trusted anyone. If you can't be here, If this ends today, you have to tell her. Don't disappear. Daniel nodded. I won't. Renee searched his face, as if looking for cracks. Annie sensed the shift before Daniel did. She climbed onto the bed again, holding her mother's hand tightly. Mom, she whispered. I'm here, baby, Renee replied. I'm just tired. Daniel stood back, giving them space while staying close enough to step in if needed. He watched as Renee brushed Annie's hair with weak fingers, the motion slow but deliberate. You were so brave, Renee said softly. Every single day. Annie shook her head. You were. Renee smiled, her eyes closing. The room grew very quiet. Daniel checked Renee's breathing, once, then again. The stillness stretched, unbearable and absolute. He felt it then the moment the air changed, the moment when waiting became something else entirely. Annie felt it too. Mom, she said. Daniel stepped forward, his heart pounding. He placed 2 fingers gently against Renee's neck, then pulled back. Annie looked at him, eyes wide, searching. Daniel swallowed hard. I'm here, he said, his voice breaking despite his effort. I've got you. Annie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against her mother's arm, staying there, silent. Daniel knelt beside the bed, one hand on Annie's back, steady and firm. Minutes passed, or seconds, he couldn't tell. Eventually, Annie lifted her head. She's not hurting anymore, right? She asked. No, Daniel said softly. She's not. Annie nodded. She reached for the phone and looked at the picture one more time. She saw it, Annie said. That's what matters. Daniel closed his eyes. Later, after the calls were made and the quiet professionals came and went, Annie sat beside Daniel on the couch, wrapped in his coat again. You didn't leave, she said, not as a question. No, he replied. She leaned into him fully this time, small and solid and real. Daniel wrapped his arm around her, feeling the weight of what had just become his responsibility. And for the first time, the word father did not feel like something borrowed. The apartment felt too quiet after they took Renee away. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the hollow kind, the kind that rang in Daniel's ears and made every small sound feel too loud. The click of the door when the last hospital worker left. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint rattle of the heater starting up again. Annie sat on the couch beside him, her legs tucked under her, her body wrapped in his coat. She hadn't said much since the bedroom. She hadn't cried either. She just sat there, staring at the opposite wall where her drawings were taped, her eyes unfocused, like she was afraid that if she blinked too long, something else would disappear. Daniel didn't rush her. He had learned, long ago, that grief didn't follow instructions. After a while, Annie spoke. Mom always made oatmeal on days like this, she said softly, even when we didn't have much. Daniel nodded. Do you want some? She considered it. Yeah, but with cinnamon, not sugar. Okay, he said. He moved carefully in the kitchen, opening cabinets without making noise, as if sound itself might be disrespectful. The oatmeal was there, half a box left. Cinnamon, too. He followed the directions exactly, even though he'd made far more complicated meals in kitchens the size of this entire apartment. When he set the bowl down in front of her, Annie picked up the spoon and stirred slowly. Dad? She asked. Yes. If I cry, will you leave? The question landed like a physical blow. Daniel crouched in front of her so they were eye level. No, he said firmly. I won't leave. Not because you cry. Not because you don't. Not for any reason. She searched his face, looking for uncertainty. Finding none, she nodded once and took a bite of oatmeal. A few minutes passed. Then her lower lip began to tremble. Daniel stayed still. She tried to swallow. Tried to keep control the way she always did. But grief, like water, finds cracks eventually. Annie dropped the spoon. The sound was small, barely a clink against the bowl. But it was enough. She folded forward, her hands clenched in his coat, and the sobs came quiet at first, then deeper. Shaking her small body, she said she was just tired. Annie cried. She promised she'd wake up. Daniel wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. He didn't shush her. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He let her cry until the sounds grew hoarse and uneven and her body sagged with exhaustion. "I know," he murmured, over and over. "I know." When the tears slowed, she stayed where she was, pressed against him like a child much younger than 6. After a while, she pulled back and wiped her nose with her sleeve, then frowned. "Sorry. That's gross." "It's okay," Daniel said. "That's what sleeves are for." That earned a small, broken smile. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, painfully normal. Daniel made calls he never expected to make. He answered questions Annie didn't want to hear. He signed papers. He listened. He stayed. No one asked him why he was there. By evening, Annie was exhausted. She lay on her bed staring at the ceiling while Daniel sat in the chair beside her, his presence steady and quiet. "Dad?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. Am I going to have to go somewhere else?" The question carried more fear than any she had asked before. Daniel chose his words carefully. "There are people who will ask questions, and there are things we'll have to figure out. But tonight, you're here. With me." She nodded, processing this. "You're not my real dad," she said suddenly. Daniel didn't flinch. "That's true. But you stayed," she continued. "That's real." "Yes," he said. She rolled onto her side to face him. "Then can you keep trying?" His chest tightened. "Yes," he said again. "I can keep trying." Annie closed her eyes. Minutes passed, her breathing evened out. Sleep claimed her gently, like she had already used up all her strength for the day. Daniel sat there long after she fell asleep. He looked around the small room, the thin blanket, the chipped paint, the stuffed animal with one eye missing tucked under Annie's arm. He thought of his own house, silent and vast, filled with things but no life. For the first time, he understood what people meant when they said loss made room for something else. He stood quietly, pulled the blanket up around Annie's shoulders, and turned off the light. In the living room, he sat on the couch again, staring at the wall where Annie's drawings hung. 2 stick figures. Always 2. He took one down gently and folded it, slipping it into his coat pocket. Not as a promise, but as a reminder. Morning came with paperwork. Daniel learned that grief, in its earliest hours, came wrapped in forms and signatures and questions that felt cruel simply because they existed. Annie sat at the small kitchen table coloring while he spoke quietly on the phone. His voice low, controlled, the way it had always been in difficult meetings. Only now, the stakes were different. He glanced at Annie often. She colored carefully, staying inside the lines with intense focus, as if precision could keep the world from shifting again. A social worker arrived just after 9. She was kind in the practiced way of someone who had learned how to soften hard truths. Daniel listened. He answered. He didn't volunteer more than necessary, but he didn't retreat either. "Yes," he said, when asked if he would stay with Annie for now. "Yes," when asked if he understood what that meant. "Yes," when asked if he was prepared for questions. Annie watched from her chair, silent, alert. When the social worker left, Annie spoke immediately. "She didn't say I had to go today." "No," Daniel said. "She didn't." Annie nodded, absorbing that like a fragile victory. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. A neighbor came by with condolences and a casserole wrapped in foil. Daniel thanked her, unsure what the right words were. Annie said thank you too, her voice polite, distant, as if she were watching herself from somewhere else. By noon, the apartment felt too small. "Do you want to go outside?" Daniel asked gently. Annie shrugged. "Where?" "There's a park a few blocks away," he said. "We don't have to stay long." She considered this, then nodded. "Okay." She put on her sneakers slowly. Daniel waited, resisting the urge to rush her. Outside, the air was crisp, leaves scattered across the sidewalk, crunching softly beneath their steps. Annie walked close to him, but didn't hold his hand. Not yet. The park was nearly empty. A swing creaked gently in the breeze. A dog barked somewhere far off. Annie walked to the bench near the sandbox and sat down, hugging her knees to her chest. "My mom used to bring me here," she said, "before she got sick." Daniel sat beside her, leaving just enough space. "She liked watching me swing," Annie continued. She said it made her feel like things were still moving forward. Daniel looked at the empty swings. "Do you want to try?" She shook her head. "Not today." They sat quietly for a while. Daniel didn't fill the silence. He had learned that some moments didn't need words, only witnesses. After a few minutes, Annie spoke again. "People are going to ask questions." "Yes," Daniel said. "Like where I'm going to live." "Yes. And if you're really my dad?" Daniel inhaled slowly. "They might." "Oh." Annie turned to him, studying his face with a seriousness that felt far older than 6. "What will you say?" The question mattered. Daniel chose honesty, the only thing that felt stable. "I'll say I'm here, and that I'm not leaving." She nodded, satisfied for now. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the apartment and made calls he had been avoiding his entire adult life. Lawyers, advisors, people who were used to solving problems with distance. He spoke firmly, drawing lines he didn't fully understand yet but knew he would defend. Annie fell asleep on the couch while he talked, curled into his coat again. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and simply watched her breathe. By evening, exhaustion set in like a heavy fog. Daniel ordered pizza because it felt normal, because it was something families did when everything else felt broken. Annie ate 2 slices, slowly, methodically. "My mom liked pepperoni," she said. Daniel nodded. Then pepperoni was the right choice. Later, as dusk settled, Annie sat on the floor with her crayons again. This time, she taped a new drawing to the wall. Daniel noticed immediately. There were 3 stick figures now. One tall, one smaller, one in between. Annie stepped back, studying her work. "It's not perfect," she said. "It doesn't have to be," Daniel replied. She looked at him. "You stayed today?" "Yes." "And yesterday?" "Yes. And when my mom—" She trailed off. Daniel finished gently. "Yes." Annie took a breath, then asked the question that had been waiting all day. "So, what happens next?" Daniel knelt beside her. "Next, we take things one day at a time." She thought about that. "Can tomorrow be one day?" He smiled faintly. "Yes. Tomorrow can be one day." That night, Daniel tucked Annie into bed again. She watched him carefully as he pulled the blanket up. "You'll be on the couch?" she asked. "Yes." "Okay. 2012 Fred." She hesitated, then reached out and caught his sleeve. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Even if people say no, can you still try?" Daniel covered her small hand with his own. "I will." Annie released him, her eyes closing almost immediately. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, feeling the weight of the words settle into him not as a title, but as a responsibility. When he finally stood and turned off the light, he knew this chapter of his life had no clean exit, and for the first time, that didn't frighten him. The first official meeting happened 2 days later. Daniel had been expecting it. He had simply underestimated how small the room would feel. Annie sat beside him at the dining table, her feet swinging slowly beneath the chair. She wore a clean sweater Daniel had bought the day before, soft, blue, chosen carefully from a rack of children's clothes he had stood in front of far too long. She kept one hand on his sleeve, not gripping, just touching, as if confirming he was still solid. The social worker, Miss Alvarez, sat across from them with a legal pad balanced on her knee. Her voice was calm, professional, practiced. "This is just a preliminary conversation," she said. "No decisions today." Annie nodded seriously, as if she understood the difference between today and all the other days that had already changed her life. Daniel listened. He answered questions. Where had Annie been living? Who else was in her family? Had Daniel known her mother long? He told the truth, all of it. He did not dress it up. He did not minimize the strangeness of how they had met. Miss Alvarez watched him closely. "And you understand," she said carefully, "that staying involved could become complicated." "Yes," Daniel replied. "It could mean long-term responsibility." "Yes, it could mean loss," she added. "If this doesn't work out." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'm aware." Annie squeezed his sleeve a little tighter. Miss Alvarez's pen paused. She glanced at Annie. "Do you want to say anything?" she asked gently. Annie shrugged. "He stayed," she said. "That's all." The room fell quiet. After the meeting ended, Miss Alvarez stood and gathered her things. "I'll be in touch," she said. "Please don't make promises yet. To her or to yourselves." Daniel nodded. Annie didn't look up. When the door closed, Annie finally spoke. "She doesn't think it'll work." Daniel crouched in front of her. "She doesn't know yet," he said. "Neither do we." "I, too." Annie considered this. "But you're still here." "Yes, that part's working," she concluded. That afternoon, Daniel took Annie with him somewhere he hadn't planned to bring anyone. His house. The gate slid open silently as the car pulled into the driveway. Annie pressed her face to the window, eyes widening. "It's big," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It is." Inside, the house echoed with emptiness. High ceilings, clean lines, everything in its place. Annie stepped inside and immediately stopped. "It's quiet," she whispered. Daniel felt it too. The difference between this silence and the apartment's. This one was polished, intentional, lonely. He showed her the kitchen, the living room, the staircase she'd asked about. Annie walked slowly, touching things lightly, as if afraid they might disappear. "Do you live here alone?" she asked. "Yes." She thought about that. "It's too quiet for just one person." Daniel smiled faintly. "I've been told." They stood in front of a wall of framed photographs, awards, buildings, moments frozen in success. Annie studied them. "None of these are you smiling." Daniel looked. She was right. That night, Annie slept in the guest room. Daniel left the door open. He stayed awake longer than he meant to, listening for sounds that didn't come. The next morning, Annie padded into the kitchen while he made coffee. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, then frowned. "Your house smells different." "Is that bad?" She shook her head. "Just different." They ate toast together at the kitchen island. Annie watched him carefully. "Are you going to work today?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said. "But not all day." "Okay." At the office, whispers followed him. He felt them like a shift in air pressure. Questions hovered, unasked. A child in his house was not part of the usual narrative. He left early. That evening, Annie sat at the table drawing again. This time, she drew the big house. She added windows, a door. Then she stopped. "Where do I go?" she asked quietly. Daniel looked at the drawing. "Anywhere you want," he said. She added a small figure near the door. "Can I put my picture on your wall?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She taped the family photo beside the awards. It didn't match. It mattered more. Later, as Daniel tucked her in, Annie looked up at him. Serious again. "People are going to decide things," she said. "About me." "Yes," Daniel agreed. She took a breath. "But you can still tell them you stayed." Daniel met her gaze. "I will." Annie nodded, satisfied. She rolled onto her side and closed her eyes. Daniel stood there a long moment, looking at the small shape in the big bed. He understood something now. This wasn't about rescuing a child. It was about choosing not to look away. Daniel learned quickly that the world noticed when he changed. At first, it was subtle. A pause in conversation when he entered a room. A glance that lingered a second too long. The polite curiosity of people who had built their careers on knowing things before they were announced. By the end of the week, it wasn't subtle anymore. Annie sat at the small desk Daniel had placed in the sunlit corner of his home office, coloring while he worked nearby. She had insisted on being close. Not touching. Just within reach. The social worker's words "don't make promises" yet still echoed in his mind. But Annie didn't ask for promises. She asked for presence. Daniel gave her that. A knock sounded at the door. Annie looked up immediately. "Is that for me?" "Probably not," Daniel said gently, standing. "But you can stay." It was his assistant, Laura, composed as always, though her eyes flicked past him to Annie with barely concealed surprise. "I didn't realize you had company," she said carefully. "I do," Daniel replied. "Come in." Annie watched silently as Laura stepped inside, her professional composure wavering just enough to notice. "I'll be in the other room," Annie said politely, sliding off her chair. Daniel shook his head. "You can stay here." Laura raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Once seated, she cleared her throat. There are questions, she began. From the board. From communications. Daniel leaned back, folding his hands. About. Laura hesitated. About the child. Daniel waited. They want to know if this is temporary, she continued. And if it's something that could reflect on the foundation. Annie stopped coloring. Daniel felt it immediately, the way her body stilled, the way children did when they sensed danger but didn't yet understand it. It reflects on me, Daniel said evenly. And I'm comfortable with that. Laura nodded slowly. I thought you'd say that. They'll want a statement. No, Daniel replied. They'll want reassurance. They won't get a statement. Silence filled the room. Laura glanced at Annie, then back at Daniel. You're serious? Yes, she exhaled. Then we should prepare for pushback. After she left, Annie spoke softly. They don't want me here. Daniel crouched beside her chair. They don't get a vote. She searched his face. Are you sure? Yes, he said. That night, Daniel received a call he had been half expecting. It was his older sister, Margaret. They hadn't spoken in months. I hear you have a child, she said without preamble. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I have, Annie. A pause. Is this some kind of phase? No. Another pause. Longer this time. You know what people will say, Margaret continued. About motives. About image. I do. And you don't care? Daniel looked across the room. Annie was curled up on the couch, asleep. Her head resting against a pillow far too large for her. His coat was draped over her again, as if she'd claimed it as her own. No, he said. Margaret sighed. You've always done things the hard way. Yes, Daniel agreed. This time, I'm doing them the right way. The call ended shortly after. The next morning, Annie woke with a question already waiting. Do you have to choose? She asked as they ate breakfast. Choose what? Between me and them. Daniel set his coffee down. No, he said. She nodded, absorbing this carefully. Later that day, Miss Alvarez returned. This time, she brought paperwork. Nothing final, she reminded them both. Just steps. Annie sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Miss Alvarez spoke gently but directly. Annie, do you understand why I'm here? Annie nodded. To see if he's going to stay. Miss Alvarez glanced at Daniel. And do you think he is? She asked Annie. Annie didn't answer immediately. She looked at Daniel, then down at her hands. He hasn't left yet, she said finally. That's how I know. Miss Alvarez wrote something down. After she left, Daniel felt the weight of what was coming settle more heavily. Background checks, home visits, evaluations. Every private corner of his life opened for inspection. That evening, Annie watched him pace. You're worried, she said. Yes, Daniel admitted. About me? About doing this right, he corrected. She nodded. My mom used to say being scared didn't mean you were wrong. Daniel stopped pacing. She was wise. Annie smiled faintly. Later, as Daniel tucked her in, she asked another question, quiet but sharp. If they say no, will you still be my dad? Daniel didn't answer right away. He sat on the edge of the bed, choosing honesty over comfort. If they say no, he said slowly, I'll still care about you. I'll still show up. I just might have to do it differently. Annie considered this. Okay, she reached out and took his hand. Then don't stop trying. Daniel squeezed her fingers gently. I won't. That night, Daniel stood in the hallway outside her room long after she fell asleep. He understood now that this wasn't a single decision. It was a series of them. Daily, public, relentless. And he was still choosing. The waiting began to change, Annie. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tantrums, no sudden silences that alarmed teachers or neighbors. It was subtler than that. She began asking fewer questions, but listening more closely. She learned which adults smiled with their mouths and which ones smiled with their eyes. She learned how to sit still in unfamiliar offices, how to fold her hands and keep her feet from swinging when serious people talked about her as if she weren't in the room. Daniel noticed everything. The first home evaluation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Annie wore a neat dress Daniel had let her choose herself. She insisted on brushing her own hair, then redoing it when she thought it wasn't good enough. Daniel watched from the doorway, resisting the urge to intervene. Miss Alvarez arrived with another woman, younger, carrying a tablet. They walked through the house slowly, asking questions, making notes. Annie followed them at a polite distance, quiet but attentive. "This is my room," Annie said when they reached the guest bedroom. "For now." The phrase lingered. Daniel caught it. So did Miss Alvarez. Later, when the questions turned more pointed, Annie excused herself and went to the living room, sitting on the couch with her coloring book. Daniel could see her from where he stood. She didn't color. She just waited. "Children bond quickly," the younger woman said, "especially after trauma." Daniel nodded. "I'm aware. And you understand the risk of disruption," she continued. "If this doesn't proceed as hoped." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not experimenting," he said. "I'm committing." Miss Alvarez met his gaze. Commitment isn't always enough. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't need to. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful response was consistency. That night, Annie asked for spaghetti. Daniel made it badly. Too much sauce. Not enough salt. She ate it anyway. "It's okay," she said. "My mom burned things sometimes too." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's comforting." After dinner, Annie sat at the table drawing again. Daniel worked nearby, reviewing documents he had never imagined would matter this much. "Dad?" she asked suddenly. "Yes. Do you remember what you said the first day?" He thought for a moment. "Which part?" "When you said you could be my dad for one day." "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. "That day feels really far away now." Daniel looked at her. "Does it?" She shrugged. "A lot happened." "Yes," he agreed. She stared at her drawing for a long time, then asked, "What if they decide I should go somewhere else?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked over and sat across from her. "That's something adults decide based on rules," he said carefully. "But rules don't always see everything." She absorbed this. "Do rules see hearts?" Daniel smiled sadly. "Not very well." "Experience," she nodded, as if that confirmed something she already suspected. The next week brought school meetings. Daniel walked Annie into the building, her hand tucked into his coat pocket. Teachers smiled politely, curiosity barely hidden. Annie's teacher, Mrs. Collins, spoke kindly, but directly. "She's bright," she said. "But she's tired." "I know," Daniel replied. "She doesn't talk about her mother," Mrs. Collins continued. "But she draws her." "A lot," Daniel nodded. "She can take all the time she needs." Mrs. Collins studied him for a moment. "You plan to be around?" "Yes," Daniel said. That answer came easily now. Outside, Annie skipped 2 steps ahead, then stopped and turned back. "You answered right," she said. "There was a right answer?" She smiled. "There always is. You just have to mean it." Daniel watched her walk ahead again, marveling at how 6-year-olds could be both fragile and unyielding at the same time. That evening, Daniel's phone rang. It was the board chair. "This is becoming visible," the man said carefully. "I assumed it would," Daniel replied. "There are concerns about distraction." Daniel glanced at Annie, curled on the couch with a book, sounding out words quietly to herself. "There are always concerns," he said. A pause. "Is this permanent?" Daniel took a breath. "I hope so." Another pause. "Hope isn't a strategy." "No," Daniel agreed. "But commitment is." The call ended shortly after. That night, Annie couldn't sleep. She padded into the living room around midnight, dragging her blanket behind her. Daniel was still awake, reading. "You too?" he asked gently. She nodded and climbed onto the couch beside him. "I keep thinking about my mom." Daniel closed the book. "Me too." She leaned her head against his arm. "Do you think she knows?" "I think she knows you're loved," he said. Annie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "If I have to go, can I still call you?" The question was careful, guarded. Daniel felt the weight of it settle into him. "Yes," he said. "You can always call me." She nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Daniel didn't move until her breathing evened out. In the dark, he understood something with painful clarity. The system would measure him, The world would judge him. But Annie would remember only one thing. Whether he stayed, the call came on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel was in his office, papers spread across the desk, though he hadn't been reading any of them. Annie sat on the rug nearby, building a careful tower out of wooden blocks, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Daniel Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, this is Judge Karen Holloway. A woman's voice said, calm and direct. I'm overseeing the temporary guardianship review for Annie Reynolds. Daniel straightened slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I won't take much of your time, she said. I've read the reports. I'd like to meet you in person. Both of you. Daniel's pulse picked up. When? Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Yes, he said immediately. We'll be there. After the call ended, Annie looked up from her blocks. That sounded serious, she said. Daniel moved closer and sat on the floor beside her. It was. She considered this. Is it about me? Yes. Her hands stilled. One block wobbled, then fell over. Am I in trouble? She asked quietly. No, Daniel said firmly. You haven't done anything wrong. She studied his face, searching for cracks. Are you? He paused. I don't think so. That night, Annie insisted on choosing her clothes for the next day. She laid them out on the bed with great care, smoothing the wrinkles with small, deliberate motions. I want to look respectful, she explained. Daniel nodded. You always do. She glanced at him. You too. He smiled faintly. I'll do my best. The courthouse was older than Daniel expected. Stone steps worn smooth by decades of wading feet. Annie held his hand tightly as they climbed them, her grip stronger than usual. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polish. Voices echoed softly. Annie leaned closer. I don't like this place, she whispered. I know, Daniel replied, but we'll be together the whole time. They were led into a small courtroom. Judge Holloway sat at the bench, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Miss Alvarez was there too, along with a court clerk and another man Daniel didn't recognize. Good morning, the judge said. Annie, isn't it? Annie nodded, then remembered her manners. Yes, ma'am. Would you like to sit? Judge Holloway asked. Annie glanced at Daniel. You can, he said softly. She climbed onto the chair beside him, her feet dangling. The judge folded her hands. This isn't a trial, she said. It's a conversation. I want to understand what's happening here. She looked at Daniel. Mr. Whitmore, you've known Annie for less than a month. Yes, Daniel said, and yet you've taken on full responsibility for her care. Yes. Why? The question was simple. The answer was not. Daniel didn't look at Annie when he spoke. He spoke to the judge, steady and honest. Because she asked for help, he said, and because I know what it means when no one answers. The judge studied him for a long moment. She turned to Annie. Annie, do you know why you're here today? Annie nodded. To see if I can stay. And what do you want? The judge asked. Annie didn't hesitate. I want to stay with him. The judge raised an eyebrow slightly. Why? Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Because he stays, she said. Even when it's hard. Silence settled over the room. Judge Holloway leaned back slightly. Staying is important, she said. But it's not the only thing that matters. She looked back at Daniel. Do you understand the permanence you're asking for? Yes, Daniel said. The loss, she continued. The scrutiny. The possibility that Annie may grow up resenting you. Daniel nodded. I understand. And you're still willing? Yes. The judge exhaled slowly. I've seen many people come into this room with good intentions, she said. Few with this level of certainty. She glanced at Miss Alvarez, who gave a small nod. For now, the judge continued, temporary guardianship will remain in place. We will proceed cautiously. Annie's shoulders slumped slightly. But, Judge Holloway added, I see no reason to disrupt what is clearly providing stability. Annie looked up sharply. The judge softened her tone. This isn't the end of the process, but it is not a no. Annie reached for Daniel's hand under the table, gripping it tightly. Thank you, Daniel said quietly. Outside, The air felt different, lighter. Annie didn't speak until they reached the steps. "So I can stay?" she asked. "For now," Daniel replied. "Yes." She nodded, absorbing that. Then she surprised him by smiling. "For now is okay," she said. That's how everything started. They walked down the steps together. In the car, Annie stared out the window for a while, then turned to him. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes. Did you mean what you said? About staying even if I get mad someday?" Daniel met her gaze. "Yes." She thought about that, then leaned back in her seat. Okay. That evening, Daniel found her adding another drawing to the wall. This one showed a courthouse with big steps. Two small figures stood at the bottom, holding hands. Underneath, in careful letters, Annie had written, "We went together." Daniel stood behind her, his chest tight. He realized then that Annie wasn't measuring time the way adults did. She was measuring moments, and today, they had one that mattered. The first crack appeared where Daniel least expected it. It came disguised as kindness. Annie's teacher called him in one afternoon after school. Mrs. Collins waited until the last child had left the classroom, then closed the door gently behind them. "She's doing well academically," Mrs. Collins said, folding her hands. "Better than I expected, given everything." Daniel nodded. "I'm glad, but," she continued carefully, "there have been moments." Daniel didn't interrupt. "She's very protective of routine," Mrs. Collins said. "If something changes, even slightly, she panics. Yesterday we had a substitute music teacher. Annie refused to leave the classroom. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "What happened?" "She asked if you knew," Mrs. Collins said. "She wanted to be sure you were still picking her up." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Did she calm down?" "Yes. Once I told her I'd called you." Mrs. Collins hesitated. "Mr. Whitmore, this isn't criticism." "I understand," Daniel said. Mrs. Collins studied him. "She's afraid of things ending without warning." Daniel nodded. "So am I." That night, Annie was unusually quiet during dinner. She ate carefully, methodically, pushing peas to one side of her plate. "How was school?" Daniel asked. She shrugged. "Fine." He waited. After a moment, she said, "Mrs. Collins called you." "Yes." Annie didn't look up. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," Daniel said immediately. "You didn't do anything wrong." She pressed her lips together. "Then why did she tell you?" Daniel considered his answer. "Because grown-ups sometimes talk when they're worried," he said. "Not because someone's in trouble." Annie nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes. If I get scared, is that bad?" Daniel shook his head. "No. It makes sense." She thought about that. Okay, but the fear didn't leave. It just learned how to be quieter. The next week brought another test. Daniel returned from work later than usual. A meeting had run long. Traffic had been unforgiving. He called ahead, but Annie didn't answer. When he opened the front door, he found her sitting on the floor by the window, fully dressed, shoes on, backpack beside her. She looked up sharply. "You said 5, she said. "I know," Daniel replied, moving toward her. "I'm sorry. I got stuck. I have to menders and rallying." Her face crumpled before she could stop it. "I thought," she swallowed hard. "I thought maybe you weren't coming." Daniel knelt in front of her. Guilt sharp and immediate. "I should have explained better," he said. "I should have called again." Annie's voice was small. "My mom always came." The words weren't accusatory. They were factual. Daniel felt them anyway. "I'm still learning," he said quietly. "But I'm here now. IMC." She nodded, but the trust took longer to come back than he wanted. That night, Annie had a nightmare. She woke crying, tangled in her sheets, calling for her mother. Daniel reached her room in seconds, sitting on the bed, pulling her gently into his arms. "I'm here," he said over and over. "You're safe." She clung to him, sobbing, her small hands fisting in his shirt. "She left," Annie cried. "Everyone leaves. We have to stake at him." Daniel held her tighter, feeling the truth and the lie tangled together in her words. "I'm not leaving," he said. She pulled back just enough to look at him. "Promise?" The word hung between them. Daniel knew better than to make promises he couldn't legally control. He also knew what Annie needed. "I promise I'll keep choosing you," he said carefully. Every day, she searched his face, measuring the weight of the words. Then she nodded. It was enough. The next morning, Miss Alvarez called. "There's a concern," she said. "Nothing alarming, but it needs to be addressed." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "About what?" "Attachment," she replied. "Specifically, anxiety around separation." Daniel said nothing. "This isn't unusual," Miss Alvarez continued, "but the court will want to see how you manage it." "How?" Daniel asked. "With boundaries," she said. "Predictability, support." Daniel looked down the hallway toward Annie's room. "We're working on that, Ard." "I know," Miss Alvarez said gently. "Just be aware. Loving her won't be enough if it turns into fear." After the call, Daniel stood still for a long time. That evening, he changed something. He made a chart. Nothing elaborate. Just a piece of paper taped to the refrigerator. It listed the days of the week. Under each day, simple notes. Pick up at 5. Dinner together. Reading before bed. Annie watched him as he taped it up. "What's that?" she asked. "So you always know what's coming," Daniel said. "And when I'll be back." She stepped closer, reading carefully. "You wrote it in marker," she said. "Yes, so it doesn't disappear. That was the idea." She nodded, then surprised him by reaching up and adding something herself. "Sunday. Pancakes." Daniel smiled. "Deal." The fear didn't vanish, but it loosened, slowly, and Daniel learned something important. Love wasn't just staying. It was proving, again and again, that staying had a shape Annie could trust. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Daniel found it tucked between utility bills and an envelope from Annie's school. Its official seal stark against the rest of the mail. He knew what it was before he opened it. His body reacted first, a tightening in his chest, a familiar sense of bracing for impact. Annie sat at the kitchen table doing homework. Her pencil gripped tightly, eraser already worn down from use. She glanced up when she heard the paper unfold. "Is that important?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said carefully. "But not bad." "Not yet." She accepted that answer, though her shoulders stiffened. The letter was formal, neutral. It informed him that the court had scheduled a comprehensive review in 6 weeks. Psychological evaluations, home assessments, school reports, a full determination of suitability. In plain terms, this was where things could change. Daniel folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. He didn't hide it. He simply didn't place it where Annie could see the words she wasn't ready to read. That night, Annie was restless. She followed him from room to room as he prepared dinner, asked questions she already knew the answers to, corrected him when he forgot to turn off a light. "You're thinking too loud," she said finally. Daniel paused. "What do you mean?" "You get quiet when you're worried," she explained. "Like my mom did." Daniel crouched, so they were eye level. "I am worried," he admitted, "but not because of you." She frowned. "Then why?" "Because sometimes the right things are still hard to keep," he said. Annie considered this. "Are we going to lose?" Daniel smiled faintly. "This isn't a game." She thought about that. "Then I don't want to play." He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth lifted. "Neither do I." The evaluation process began almost immediately. A child psychologist came first. Dr. Patel was kind, soft-spoken, with a habit of kneeling to Annie's height instead of talking down to her. Annie liked her immediately, which worried Daniel more than if she hadn't. They sat in the living room while Annie drew pictures and answered questions. "What do you feel when you think about your mom?" Dr. Patel asked gently. Annie paused. "Sad," she said, then added, "and safe, because she loved me." "And when you think about Daniel?" the doctor asked. Annie didn't hesitate. "Safe," she said, "and scared." Daniel's breath caught. "Scared of what?" Dr. Patel asked. Annie shrugged. That it could stop. The honesty in her voice was devastating. Later, when Dr. Patel spoke privately with Daniel, she didn't sugarcoat her concerns. "She's attached," she said. "Deeply. That's understandable. but attachment built on fear of loss can turn into anxiety if it isn't addressed. I know, Daniel said. We're working on it. She needs consistency, Dr. Patel continued, and reassurance that doesn't depend on perfection. Daniel nodded. I'm not perfect. No, she agreed. But you're present. That matters. The next visit was less gentle. A representative from Child Services walked through the house with a checklist, measuring rooms, noting exits, asking about schedules and support systems. Annie stayed close to Daniel's side, her hand hooked into his pocket, listening. Does she sleep through the night? The woman asked. Usually, Daniel replied. Annie shook her head. Sometimes I wake up. The woman looked at her. Why? Annie glanced at Daniel, then down. Just to check. Daniel felt the words like a bruise. That night, he made another change. He bought a small lamp and placed it in Annie's room, soft and warm. He left the door open wider. He told her where he would be, every night, without being asked. She slept better after that. The hardest part came unexpectedly. At school pickup, another parent approached Daniel, a woman he recognized only vaguely, her tone friendly but her eyes curious. I heard Annie's mother passed, she said. I'm sorry. Thank you, Daniel replied. And now she's with you? The woman continued. That's generous. Daniel stiffened. That's not why. The woman smiled awkwardly. Of course, it's just unusual. Annie stood beside him, silent. On the drive home, she stared out the window. They think I'm temporary, she said quietly. Daniel glanced at her. Who? People, she replied. Like I'm a guest. Daniel pulled the car over. He turned to face her fully. You are not temporary, he said. No matter what happens in court, no matter what words people use, you matter. You belong. Annie searched his face, weighing the truth of it. Even if I don't stay here forever? She asked. Daniel chose honesty again. Even then, she nodded slowly. Okay, with Addie. The night before the final evaluation, Annie asked a question she'd been holding back for weeks. If they say no, she said, lying on her side, facing him. Will I be in trouble? No, Daniel said immediately. Will you? She pressed. He paused. I'll be disappointed, he said, and sad, and angry, but not at you. She absorbed this. Will you miss me? Daniel swallowed hard. Yes, that seemed to satisfy her. She rolled over and fell asleep. Daniel didn't. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could end badly. All the ways he could fail despite trying his hardest. All the ways Annie had already reshaped his life in ways he could never undo. He understood now that loving her meant accepting uncertainty, and choosing her anyway. The final review took place on a Monday morning, under a sky so clear it felt almost cruel. Daniel parked the car outside the courthouse and turned off the engine, though neither of them moved right away. Annie sat very straight in her seat, hands folded in her lap, wearing the navy dress she had chosen days ago and refused to wrinkle. Her shoes were polished. Her hair was neatly braided. She looked prepared in a way no 6-year-old should have to be. Daniel reached over and squeezed her hand once. We'll walk in together, he said. She nodded. I know. Inside, the building felt colder than before. The same stone floors. The same echoing steps. But this time, Annie didn't hesitate. She walked beside him without clinging, her chin lifted, as if she had decided something important about herself. Judge Holloway was already seated when they entered. Miss Alvarez sat to one side, her expression careful. Dr. Patel was there too, her presence both reassuring and unsettling. Daniel took in every face, cataloging them like variables he couldn't control. Annie climbed onto the chair beside him without being told. Good morning, the judge said. Good morning, Annie. Good morning, ma'am, Annie replied clearly. Judge Holloway gave a small nod. You look very composed today. Annie thought about that. I practiced being brave, she said. Something passed across the judge's face, something human. The proceedings were calm, almost deceptively so. Reports were summarized. Observations were shared. Daniel answered questions about his work schedule, his support system, his plans. He didn't embellish. He didn't plead. He spoke plainly, steadily. The way he had learned mattered most. Then the judge turned to Annie. "Annie," she said gently, "do you understand why everyone is here today?" Annie nodded. "To decide if I can stay." "And what do you want?" the judge asked. Annie didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Daniel, then looked forward again. "I want to stay," she said, "but not if it makes things bad." The room stilled. "What do you mean?" the judge asked. Annie's voice was quiet but sure. "I don't want him to be in trouble because of me, or sad because he tried." Daniel felt his chest tighten. Judge Holloway leaned forward slightly. "And what if staying means things will be hard sometimes?" Annie nodded. "They already are." "Well," a long silence followed. The judge leaned back, folding her hands. "Thank you for being honest," she said. Then she turned to Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore, you've heard concerns about attachment and dependency. You've also demonstrated stability and commitment. This is not a simple case." Daniel nodded once. "I understand." The judge glanced at her notes, then up again. "This court is tasked with protecting Annie's best interests. Permanence matters. So does safety. So does emotional health." Daniel waited. "For that reason," Judge Holloway continued, "the court is prepared to move forward with permanent guardianship, contingent on continued support and counseling." For a moment, Daniel wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Annie froze. "Does that mean—" Annie began, then stopped herself, pressing her lips together. Judge Holloway smiled faintly. "It means you can stay." Annie inhaled sharply. Then, without warning, she slid off the chair and wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist, holding on like the ground might disappear. He closed his eyes and held her, careful, steady. The judge cleared her throat. "I'll allow a moment," she said quietly. Outside the courthouse, the air felt warmer. Annie stood on the steps, blinking like she was adjusting to new light. "So, I'm staying," she said finally. "Yes," Daniel replied. "You are." She looked up at him. "For real?" "For real." She nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded drawing she'd carried for weeks, the one of the two figures holding hands. "I was going to give this back if I had to go," she said, "but I don't." Daniel knelt and took the paper carefully. "I'm glad you don't." That evening, they didn't celebrate with anything big. No cake, no announcement, just takeout and quiet. Annie taped a new drawing to the wall that night. This one had three figures again, but the lines were darker, more confident. Underneath, she wrote, "We stayed." Later, as Daniel tucked her in, she looked at him seriously. "You don't have to keep proving it now," she said. Daniel smiled. "I still will." She yawned. "Okay." As he turned off the light, she added, almost as an afterthought, "My mom would have liked you." Daniel paused in the doorway. "I hope so." 12. "I know so," Annie replied, already half asleep. Daniel stood there for a long moment, feeling the quiet settle, not hollow this time, but full. He understood now that the hardest part hadn't been the waiting. It had been the choosing. And tomorrow, he would wake up and choose again. Life did not soften after the ruling. It simply continued. Daniel learned this quickly, in the way Annie still paused at doorways as if expecting to be told to wait, and in how she listened too carefully when adults spoke in low voices. Permanent guardianship did not erase memory. It did not undo loss. It only changed the direction of the road. The first morning after the decision, Annie woke before him. Daniel found her sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed, backpack on, hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for instructions. "You don't have school today," he said gently, checking the clock. "I know," Annie replied. "I just didn't want to be late." He smiled, though something tight lingered in his chest. Late for what? She thought about it. For staying. Daniel poured coffee, then paused and reached for the kettle instead. "How about pancakes?" he asked. "It's Sunday." Her eyes widened. "With real syrup?" "Yes," he said. "And blueberries, if you want." She nodded solemnly. "That sounds correct." They cooked together. Slowly, carefully. Annie insisted on stirring, on flipping one pancake herself, on wiping the counter when flour spilled. Daniel let her. He was learning when to guide and when to step back. After breakfast, She wandered into the living room and stood in front of the wall of drawings. She studied them for a long time. "Do we take these down?" she asked. Daniel joined her. "Only if you want to." She shook her head. "No. I like seeing where I came from." He understood. The days that followed were filled with adjustments no one warned him about. Calls from the school district, meetings with counselors, paperwork that seemed endless. But there were also small things, quiet victories that didn't make it into reports. Annie slept through the night for the first time in weeks. She laughed. Really laughed. At a silly joke Daniel told without thinking. She stopped checking the refrigerator chart quite so often. One afternoon, as Daniel worked at the dining table, Annie sat across from him doing homework. She finished early and watched him for a while. "You're still working," she observed. "Yes," Daniel said. "Some things don't change." She nodded. "That's good." He looked up. "Why?" "Because if everything changed at once," she said, "it would feel fake." 80. Daniel smiled. "That's surprisingly wise." She shrugged. "My mom used to say big changes need small days." That night, Daniel received another call, this one from his sister. "I heard," Margaret said. "About the ruling." "Yes," Daniel replied. A pause. "I didn't think you'd go through with it." "I did," he said. Another pause. Softer this time. "Do you want help?" The question surprised him more than it should have. "Yes," he said honestly. "I think I do." Margaret exhaled. "Then I'll come by. Soon." When he told Annie later, she tilted her head. "Is she nice?" "She's learning," Daniel said. "That's okay," Annie replied. "I'm learning too." A week later, Annie had her first counseling session since the ruling. Daniel waited in the hallway, reading the same page of a magazine over and over without absorbing a word. When Annie emerged, she looked thoughtful rather than upset. "How was it?" he asked. "She asked about my mom," Annie said. "And about you." "Well, first, and I told her you stay," Annie said. "Even when you don't know what to do." Daniel swallowed. "That sounds accurate." That evening, Annie brought out the photo again, the one from the hospital. She held it carefully, like something fragile but precious. "Do you think my mom would like it here?" she asked, gesturing around the house. Daniel considered the question. "I think she'd like knowing you're safe," he said, "and that you're not alone." Annie nodded. "Me too," with an eyes praised. She placed the photo in a frame Daniel had bought but hadn't yet used, setting it on the bookshelf between his awards and business books. "It belongs here," she said. Daniel didn't disagree. Later that night, Annie climbed into bed without being asked. Her movements easy now, unguarded. As Daniel turned off the light, she spoke. "Dad?" "Yes. You know you don't have to be perfect now, right?" He paused. "What makes you say that?" "Because we're not waiting anymore," she said. "We're just living." Daniel stood there, absorbing the quiet truth of it. "Yes," he said softly. "We are." When he closed the door, Daniel didn't feel the old tension, the constant readiness to defend, to explain, to prove. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had loosened. He understood something important now. Guardianship wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of responsibility without an audience. And for the first time, that felt like exactly where he belonged. The first real test of their new normal came without warning. Daniel was in the kitchen late one afternoon, reviewing emails on his tablet while Annie sat at the counter eating apple slices. The house was quiet in the comfortable way it had begun to be. No tension, no waiting for bad news to arrive. The doorbell rang. Annie stiffened immediately. Daniel noticed. "I'll get it," he said, keeping his voice even. She nodded, but her eyes followed him closely as he walked to the door. When he opened it, a man stood on the porch holding a clipboard, his jacket zipped halfway up, his expression neutral. "Mr. Whitmore?" the man asked. "Yes. Child Services. Just a follow-up visit. Shouldn't take long." Annie slid off the stool before Daniel could say anything. She stood at the edge of the hallway, her hands clenched at her sides. Daniel turned back to the man. "Of course," he said. "Come in." The man stepped inside, glancing around, checking boxes in his mind. Annie watched him with careful stillness, the way prey watched movement. "This isn't an inspection," the man said, noticing her. "Just routine." Annie didn't answer. Daniel crouched beside her. "You want to sit at the table?" he asked softly. "Or stay here with me?" She took a second, then slipped her hand into his. "Here." The man noticed that too. They sat in the living room. Questions were asked. Answers were given. Everything was calm, procedural, polite. Still, Annie's body stayed tense. When it was over and the door closed again, Annie didn't move. Daniel waited. "Are they going to keep coming?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes." Her face fell. "Not because you did anything wrong," he added. "Because it's their job to make sure things stay right." She considered that. "Do they check on everyone?" "Not everyone," Daniel said. "But everyone who matters." That seemed to help a little. That evening, Annie refused to go to bed. She brushed her teeth. She put on her pajamas. She sat on the bed with her blanket pulled up to her chest and stayed wide awake. Daniel sat in the chair beside her, reading. "You can turn the light off," she said. "Do you want me to?" he asked. She hesitated. "Not yet." Minutes passed. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes." "Are they ever going to stop making sure?" Daniel thought about that. "Eventually," he said. "But even then, people still watch out for each other." "That part doesn't stop." She nodded. "Okay." But when he stood to leave, her hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve. "Just for a minute," she said quickly. "Until I'm asleep." Daniel sat back down without comment. It was the first time she had asked since the ruling. He stayed until her breathing slowed, until her grip loosened, until sleep took her fully. That night, Daniel lay awake thinking about something Judge Holloway had said during the hearing. Permanence matters. So does emotional health. He understood now that staying wasn't just about being present. It was about teaching Annie how to be okay when he wasn't right there. The next day, he tried something different. After school, Annie climbed into the car and buckled herself in, as she always did. "I have a meeting tomorrow," Daniel said as he started the engine. "I'll be late." She'd in time. Annie nodded, waiting. "I'll be home by 7, he continued. "Margaret is coming over to stay with you." Annie turned to look at him. "Your sister?" "Yes." She thought about it. "Okay." No panic. No questions. That surprised him. That evening, Daniel told Margaret everything she needed to know. Annie listened from the doorway, quiet but curious. Margaret knelt in front of her. "I hear you're very brave," she said. Annie considered this. "I practice." Margaret smiled. "Good. I'm still learning." When Daniel left the next evening, Annie stood at the door and watched him put on his coat. "You said 7, she said. "Yes," he replied. She nodded. "I'll tell you if you're late. I expect nothing less." He left. The meeting ran long. At 6:45, Daniel checked his phone. No messages. At 7:10, his phone buzzed. "You're late, but it's okay. We're eating." Daniel exhaled, a smile breaking free before he could stop it. When he walked through the door at 7:22, Annie was at the table with Margaret, mid-sentence, animated, alive. "You're 22 minutes late," Annie announced. "I know," Daniel said. "Thank you for your patience." She nodded gravely. "You're welcome." That night, as Daniel tucked her in, Annie looked up at him. "You came back," she said. "Yes. Even when you were late." "Yes." She smiled faintly. "That helps." Daniel understood then that this was the work now. Not grand gestures, not courtrooms or rulings, just coming back, again and again. When he turned off the light and closed the door, he felt something settle into place. Trust wasn't a switch. It was a rhythm. The incident happened on a Friday. Ordinary enough that Daniel almost missed its significance. He was in the kitchen reviewing notes for an upcoming foundation meeting when Annie came home from school quieter than usual. She hung her backpack on its hook, lined up her shoes carefully, and walked past him without their usual greeting. "Hey," Daniel said, looking up. "Everything okay?" Annie nodded too quickly. "Yeah." Daniel didn't press. He had learned that forcing words too soon only taught her to hide better. Dinner passed with polite conversation and short answers. Annie ate, but slowly. She didn't ask for seconds. When she finished, she took her plate to the sink without being told and disappeared into her room. That was when Daniel knew. He knocked lightly before entering. Annie sat on the floor with her back against the bed, knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't crying. She was staring at the wall, breathing carefully, like someone trying not to spill something already full. "Do you want to talk?" he asked. She shrugged. "It's stupid." "Then it probably matters," Daniel said, sitting down a few feet away. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Annie spoke. "A boy at school said, 'I don't really belong here.'" Daniel felt his spine straighten. "What do you mean?" "He said I only live with you because my mom died," Annie continued, her voice flat, "and that someday I'll have to go back to where I came from." Daniel didn't interrupt. "And another girl said, 'You're not really my dad,'" Annie added. "She said, 'You're just pretending, because you're rich.'" There it was. The thing Daniel had known would come, sooner or later. He kept his voice steady. "What did you say?" Annie hesitated. "Nothing. Mrs. Collins told them to stop." "That's good," Daniel said. Annie shook her head. "It doesn't stop how it feels." Daniel nodded. "No, it doesn't." She picked at the seam of the carpet. "Am I temporary?" The question wasn't new, but it cut just as deeply. "No," Daniel said firmly. "You are not temporary, but they don't see it," Annie said. "They look at me, and they see something else." Daniel understood that too. He moved closer, not touching, giving her space while staying present. "People see with what they know," he said. "And sometimes what they know is wrong." She frowned. "Then why do they say it like it's true?" "Because saying something doesn't make it true," Daniel replied. "It just means they don't understand." Annie was quiet for a long moment. "Can they make me leave?" she asked. Daniel answered honestly. "No. Not because of words. Not because of who you are." She studied his face, looking for the careful language that meant doubt. Finding none, she nodded slowly. The next morning, Daniel walked Annie to school. That alone changed things. Parents noticed. Teachers noticed. Whispers followed them down the hallway. Annie held her head high, her hand tucked into his coat pocket like she always did when she was bracing herself. Mrs. Collins met them at the door. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "So am I," Daniel replied. They spoke briefly in the hallway. Mrs. Collins didn't minimize what had happened. She didn't dramatize it either. "We're addressing it," she said. "But I wanted you to know." "Thank you," Daniel said. As they turned to leave, the boy who had spoken yesterday passed by. He slowed when he saw Daniel, then looked away. Annie noticed. "He didn't say anything," she whispered. Daniel squeezed her hand once. "Sometimes, silence is learning." That afternoon, Daniel made a decision he had been postponing. At the foundation meeting, when conversation drifted toward optics and public image, Daniel spoke up. "We need to expand our education initiatives," he said, "specifically around inclusion and family diversity." A few heads turned. "This isn't about charity," Daniel continued calmly. "It's about dignity. Children shouldn't have to defend their existence." There was a pause, then nods, then questions. Daniel answered them all. That evening, Annie waited for him at the door, her backpack still on. "You went to work," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "And I talked about you." Her eyes widened. "You did?" "Not just you," he corrected. "Kids like you." She considered this. "Did you say good things?" "I said true things," Daniel said. She smiled faintly. "That's better." That night, Annie brought out a new drawing. It showed a school, a house, and a line connecting them. On one side stood several small figures. On the other stood two, holding hands. "What's the line?" Daniel asked. "That's me going back and forth," Annie said. "I don't disappear." Daniel nodded. "That's right. Later, as he tucked her in, she asked quietly, "Do you get tired of explaining me?" Daniel paused. "No," he said. "I get tired of people not listening. That's different." She seemed to like that answer. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes. Thank you for standing up," she said. "Even when I didn't." Daniel leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You don't always have to," he said. "That's part of my job." She closed her eyes, breathing steady now. When Daniel turned off the light, he understood something with new clarity. Love didn't erase injustice. It answered it, and tomorrow, he would answer again. The final moment did not come with applause. It came on an ordinary morning. Months later, when Daniel stood in the kitchen tying his shoes, while Annie sat at the table eating cereal, humming softly to herself. Sunlight spilled through the window, catching dust in the air. The refrigerator chart was still there, but no one checked it anymore. "Dad," Annie said suddenly. "Yes. Do you remember the hospital bench?" Daniel paused, one shoe half-tied. "I do. Well, I was scared there," she said, not looking up. "I didn't know what would happen next." Daniel finished tying his shoe and sat across from her. "So was I." She nodded, as if that confirmed something important. "I thought if I didn't ask, nothing would change." Daniel studied her face, the confidence that had grown slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. "Asking was brave," he said. She shrugged. Staying was braver, better. They walked to school together that morning, side by side, not holding hands this time. Annie had grown into that space too, knowing he was there without needing to prove it every step. At the school gate, she turned to him. "You don't have to walk me in today." Daniel smiled. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "I know where I'm going." He watched her go, her backpack bouncing lightly, her steps sure. She didn't look back. For a moment, Daniel stood there, feeling the quiet pride and ache that came with letting go in small, necessary ways. That afternoon, a package arrived. Annie found it first, dragging it into the living room with exaggerated effort. "It's heavy," she announced. Inside was a framed photograph, the one from the hospital. Annie stared at it, her fingers tracing the glass. "I forgot how tired my mom looked," she said softly. Daniel knelt beside her. "She loved you very much. Thanks for watching." Anna reasoned. "I know," Annie replied. "I can tell." They placed the photo on a low shelf, at Annie's height. Not hidden, not elevated, just there. Later that evening, Daniel received an email confirming what he already knew. The final paperwork was complete. No more reviews, no more visits, no more waiting. He didn't print it. He closed the laptop and joined Annie on the couch, where she was sprawled with a book, one leg hooked over the armrest. "It's done," he said quietly. She looked up. "What's done?" "The part where people decide." Annie thought about that. "Good," she said. "They were taking a long time." Daniel laughed softly. That night, Annie asked to hear a story. "About what?" he asked. "About you," she said. "When you were little," Daniel hesitated, then began. He told her about small apartments, about learning to be quiet, about wishing for things he couldn't name back then. Annie listened without interrupting, her eyes serious. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You were lonely," she said finally. "Yes," Daniel replied. "But you didn't disappear," Annie said. "You stayed." Daniel smiled. "I guess I did." She closed her eyes, satisfied. As Daniel turned off the light and stood in the doorway, Annie spoke again, her voice already drifting towards sleep. "Dad, yes. If someone asks me one day how I got here, what should I say?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Tell them the truth," he said. "You asked for help." And someone answered. Annie smiled faintly. "Okay." The house settled into its nighttime rhythm. No hollow silence now, just the quiet of belonging. Daniel stood for a moment longer, then closed the door gently. He thought of that first question on the hospital bench. The impossible weight of it, the way it had cracked his life open. He understood now that the question had never been about pretending. It had been about courage, about choosing to step into someone else's fear and not look away, about understanding that justice doesn't always arrive loudly, but when it does, it changes everything. In the end, Annie had asked for a father for one day. What she found was someone willing to stay for a lifetime. And what Daniel found was a family he hadn't known he was missing until the moment he said yes. The lesson of this story is simple, but not easy. Real family is built by presence, not by blood or promises made too quickly. A child does not need perfection or wealth, she needs someone who stays, who shows up again and again, even when it is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or frightening. Courage is not found in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency. Answering a desperate question with honesty, choosing responsibility without certainty, and standing beside the vulnerable when walking away would be easier. In the end, justice and love are not loud. They are proven through loyalty, patience, and the willingness to say yes and mean it every day after. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,